They say some people run toward love and others run from it. But what happens when the one who runs finally stops? When the walls built for protection start to feel like a cage, and the silence they once called peace begins to sound like loneliness? This is the story of the avoidant. The one who hides not because they don't care, but because caring feels like drowning. The avoidant's inner conflict is one of the most misunderstood psychological struggles in human connection. On the surface, they appear calm, detached, and self-sufficient, almost as if love is something they can take or leave without consequence. But beneath that composed exterior lies a mind in quiet turmoil, constantly wrestling with opposing desires, to connect and to retreat, to love and to protect, to be seen and to stay hidden. Their distance is not born out of cruelty, but from a deeply ingrained fear that closeness will expose them to rejection, judgment, or loss of self. They crave love the way a thirsty traveler craves water, yet when it is finally within reach, their instincts drive them to turn away. The roots of this conflict often lie in early experiences where emotional needs were met with inconsistency, criticism, or neglect. A child who learned that vulnerability led to pain quickly internalized a lesson. To be safe, one must not depend on others. Over time, that survival strategy became a personality pattern. The avoidant learned to equate self-reliance with safety and emotional detachment with strength. What others interpret as indifference is, in reality, a sophisticated defense mechanism crafted by a mind that once needed to protect itself from emotional chaos. This armor becomes so much a part of them that they begin to believe it defines who they are. In relationships, this inner conflict plays out like a silent war. The avoidant may feel drawn to someone's warmth and affection, but as soon as emotional intimacy deepens, anxiety rises. Their subconscious starts whispering that dependence is dangerous, that the other person's expectations will trap or consume them. So they withdraw, not because they stopped caring, but because caring feels unsafe. They might rationalize this distance as needing space or time to think, but beneath those words lies a deeper truth. Closeness activates their old fears of being controlled, abandoned, or rejected. Their partner, sensing this emotional retreat, often tries harder to reach them, which only intensifies the avoidant's discomfort. The more love is offered, the more they instinctively recoil, creating a cycle of pursuit and withdrawal that slowly erodes trust on both sides. The most tragic part of the avoidant's inner conflict is that they long for the very connection they push away. They observe others who seem to love freely, who can express emotions without fear, and a part of them aches with envy. They wish they could do the same, but every attempt at vulnerability feels like walking into a storm without shelter. Even when they find someone patient and understanding, they struggle to accept love without suspicion. Compliments might feel manipulative, affection might feel suffocating, and commitment might feel like a trap. Their mind constantly scans for threats where none exist, convinced that love always comes with a hidden cost. This internal struggle leaves them in a paradoxical state, hungry for closeness but terrified of it. They tell themselves they prefer independence, yet loneliness follows them like a quiet shadow. Nights feel longer, connections feel shallow, and even in moments of comfort, there's a sense of something missing. What they truly fear is not love itself, but the loss of control love demands. To love deeply is to surrender, to open oneself to uncertainty, to trust another with the parts of us we barely understand ourselves. For the avoidant, that surrender feels like annihilation, a threat to the fragile sense of safety they've built through years of emotional restraint. So they remain guarded, trapped within a fortress of their own making, unable to realize that the walls meant to protect them have become the very thing that keeps them from being free. The illusion of control is the avoidant's most powerful yet deceptive shield, On the surface, it gives them a sense of stability and safety. They believe that by managing the distance in their relationships, by deciding how much to give and when to pull away, they can protect themselves from emotional pain. This need for control is not about dominance. It's about survival. Somewhere in their past, they learned that emotions were unpredictable, that love came with conditions, or that closeness led to hurt. So they built a life governed by control of their emotions, their environment, and especially their relationships. To them, control equals safety, and vulnerability equals danger. But this control is an illusion, a fragile construct that keeps them from the very intimacy they crave. In relationships, the avoidant often appears confident and self-contained, as if they hold all the power. They rarely chase. Instead, they attract. They prefer partners who are emotionally expressive, those who pour their hearts out freely, because it allows the avoidant to stay in the position of observer rather than participant. Yet beneath that cool demeanor, there's a quiet dependence on this dynamic. By keeping others emotionally invested while they remain slightly detached, they maintain a false sense of superiority, a feeling that they can't be hurt because they're the ones holding back. The irony is that this distance doesn't protect them from pain, it merely delays it. Every time they withhold emotion, they reinforce their own loneliness, confusing control with strength and detachment with peace. Their relationships tend to follow a predictable pattern. At first, the avoidant enjoys the connection, as long as it feels manageable and light. They engage with charm, attentiveness, and even warmth. But as soon as the bond deepens and emotional dependency forms, they feel a growing sense of unease. They start noticing small flaws in their partner, magnifying them as reasons to pull away. They might criticize, withdraw, or become preoccupied with work or personal goals, anything that reestablishes emotional distance. To the avoidant, this withdrawal feels like regaining control, a necessary act to prevent being consumed by another person's emotional needs. What they fail to see is that in doing so, they aren't escaping entrapment. They are perpetuating isolation. The illusion of control also extends inward. Avoidants often suppress their own emotions, convincing themselves they can think their way through feelings. They intellectualize pain, rationalize heartbreak, and label attachment as weakness. This detachment becomes a form of emotional self-rejection. By denying their own needs, they avoid the discomfort of dependence, but also cut themselves off from authenticity. They may tell themselves that they simply don't need much from others, that love is overrated, or that solitude is freedom. But beneath that narrative lies an unspoken ache, a longing for connection they refuse to admit. Their control over emotions becomes a form of emotional imprisonment, where everything feels orderly but lifeless. Over time, this illusion begins to crumble. The avoidant starts noticing that their relationships never seem to reach the depth they secretly long for. They might look back at past partners and realize a pattern. People who loved them deeply eventually grew tired of feeling unseen. The avoidant's control, once a source of comfort, becomes a silent poison that erodes every bond they form. They may blame others for being too needy or emotional, but somewhere inside, they know the truth. The problem isn't the depth of others' emotions, it's their inability to meet it. The illusion of control shields them from rejection, but it also blocks love from entering. It convinces them that they are safe, when in reality, they are alone in a world carefully constructed to protect them from the one thing they truly desire, to be fully known and still chosen. The turning point of solitude is where the avoidant's carefully maintained world begins to unravel. For years, they have relied on distance as their armor, believing that emotional detachment keeps them safe from the unpredictable storms of intimacy. They pride themselves on being self-sufficient, on needing no one, on being untouchable. But slowly, often without realizing it, the walls they built to keep pain out also begin to keep life out. The silence they once cherished turns heavy. The freedom they once celebrated begins to feel empty, and the solitude they once used as a sanctuary becomes a prison. What was once a choice, to stay distant, to stay guarded, starts to feel like a curse they can no longer escape. In the quiet of solitude, the avoidant is confronted with the one thing they have always avoided: themselves. When there is no one left to blame, no partner to pull away from, no emotional demand to resist, they are forced to face the emptiness within. The distractions that once worked, work, hobbies, casual relationships, or endless independence, begin to lose their power. They start to notice the silence in moments where connection used to exist. It is in this silence that the truth begins to whisper. They are not at peace. They are merely disconnected. Their solitude no longer feels like strength. It feels like loss. They may not show it outwardly, but internally, the weight of isolation begins to press harder than any relationship ever did. At this turning point, something begins to shift. The avoidant starts remembering the faces of people who cared for them, people they pushed away in fear of losing control. They replay moments of closeness and withdrawal, the times when someone reached out and they recoiled, not because they didn't care, but because caring felt unsafe. These memories become ghosts that haunt the stillness. The realization dawns that their independence, while protective, has come at a great cost. They have mastered the art of being alone, but they have forgotten how to be known. This recognition doesn't come with anger, it comes with sorrow, a quiet grief for the connections lost, for the chances of love that slipped away, not because others failed them, but because they couldn't let love stay. As solitude deepens, the avoidant begins to sense the limits of control. They start to see that self-sufficiency cannot replace intimacy, that autonomy without connection is hollow. The independence they once admired in themselves now feels like isolation dressed in pride. They begin to notice the small cracks in their armor, the moments when they crave a hand to hold, a voice to hear, a presence that reminds them they're not alone in the world. But when they reach for it, no one is there, because their patterns have taught others to stay away. This is the quiet breaking point, where loneliness transforms from something they chose to something that chooses them. In these moments, the avoidant's mind becomes their greatest battleground. Part of them still clings to the old belief that needing others is weakness, that vulnerability leads to pain. But another part, the one long buried beneath layers of fear, begins to stir, the part that remembers what it felt like to love, to be seen, to be held without judgment. The conflict between these two selves creates a deep tension, one that cannot be ignored forever. For the first time, they begin to question the cost of their avoidance. What if safety was never meant to be found in distance, but in trust? What if control was never protection, but resistance to healing? It is here, in the turning point of solitude, that the avoidant stands at the edge of transformation. Whether they continue to hide or begin to open depends not on who enters their life next, but on whether they finally choose to meet themselves without fear. Who the avoidant actually ends up with is rarely who others expect, and often not who they truly need. Many imagine that once an avoidant finds someone patient enough, loving enough, and persistent enough, they will finally open up and transform into a devoted partner. But the reality is far more complex. The avoidant does not usually end up with the empathic, emotionally expressive person who once tried to break through their walls. They end up with someone who mirrors their emotional landscape, someone equally unavailable, equally guarded, equally afraid of intimacy. This pairing feels safe, familiar, and calm. There are no overwhelming emotions, no pressure for vulnerability, no threat of deep connection. It gives the illusion of peace, but beneath it lies an emotional emptiness that neither partner fully acknowledges. When two avoidant individuals come together, the relationship often begins with ease. Both appreciate each other's independence and respect for boundaries. There is no chasing, no emotional chaos, no constant need for reassurance. Each person feels relieved not to be smothered by the other's affection. To them, this feels like harmony. They tell themselves they've finally found someone who understands their need for space. But this balance is deceptive, for what they have created is not intimacy, but coexistence. Their connection is built on mutual avoidance, on an unspoken agreement to stay close enough to be comfortable, but far enough to be safe. It's a relationship that thrives on stability, but one that rarely touches the depths of emotional truth. This kind of bond can last for years because it lacks the turbulence that forces growth. There are few arguments, few confrontations, and little drama. From the outside, it might look like a mature, peaceful relationship. But beneath that calm surface, there is a quiet disconnection. Conversations remain surface level, affection is restrained, and moments of vulnerability are quickly smoothed over with logic or distraction. Each partner senses that something deeper is missing, but can't articulate what it is. They confuse the absence of conflict with the presence of love, not realizing that what they've built is an emotional truce rather than a true union. They are together, but not fully seen, close, but not truly known. The reason the avoidant ends up with such a partner is because emotional familiarity feels safer than emotional fulfillment. They are drawn to what mirrors their inner world. Someone who is too open, too expressive, or too emotionally demanding feels threatening to their sense of control. But someone who keeps the same distance, who doesn't demand too much, feels like relief. This is the paradox of the avoidance love life. They reject the intensity that could heal them and embrace the comfort that sustains their avoidance. It's not that they don't want love. It's that they only know how to survive love in small, controlled doses. In this dynamic, both partners protect themselves from vulnerability, and in doing so, protect themselves from true connection. Over time, though, the cracks begin to show. The relationship, while peaceful, lacks the fire that nourishes the soul. There are moments when one or both partners feel the ache of something missing, the kind of closeness they once dismissed as too risky. They might watch others in love and feel an unspoken envy, a longing for the warmth they've spent their lives avoiding. Sometimes this realization leads to quiet resignation, where they accept emotional distance as the price of safety. Other times it sparks an awakening, a recognition that love without vulnerability is merely companionship without depth. Until that awakening occurs, the avoidant remains in a cycle of emotional sameness, mistaking comfort for connection and safety for love, bound to someone who reflects their own inability to let love in. The inevitable awakening of the avoidant is not a sudden moment of clarity, but a slow unraveling of everything they once believed kept them safe. It begins quietly, often after years of emotional detachment and failed attempts at connection. At first, they might not even realize what is happening. They simply begin to feel a restlessness they can't explain, a subtle emptiness that no achievement, distraction, or new relationship can fill. The independence that once made them proud starts to feel like loneliness. The silence they once used as a shield begins to echo with unanswered questions. They start to see patterns in their life, the repetition of the same emotional distance no matter who they're with, and somewhere deep within, they sense that the problem isn't the world around them, but something within themselves. This awakening often begins with pain. It might come after losing someone who truly cared for them, after realizing they pushed away the very person who tried to love them without conditions. It might come from the exhaustion of pretending they don't need anyone, or from the quiet ache of watching life move on without ever feeling truly connected to it. The avoidant begins to notice how often they've mistaken control for peace, solitude for strength, and indifference for protection. They start to see how much of their emotional life has been lived in shadow, guided by fears they never confronted. This realization can be terrifying because it forces them to face the truth they've spent their entire lives avoiding, that their walls have not protected them from pain, they have only preserved it. As this awareness grows, the avoidant begins to feel the weight of their own isolation. They may find themselves craving connection in ways that feel unfamiliar and uncomfortable. They might want to reach out, to express, to feel, but their old patterns resist. It becomes a battle between the mind that seeks control and the heart that longs for release. The mind tells them that vulnerability will lead to loss, while the heart whispers that without it, they are already lost. This internal struggle marks the beginning of transformation. The avoidant starts to observe their defenses in real time, the way they pull back when someone gets close, the way they dismiss affection, the way they rationalize emotional distance as maturity. Awareness doesn't dissolve these patterns instantly, but it begins to weaken their power. The next stage of awakening is acceptance. The avoidant begins to understand that their fear of intimacy was never a flaw, but a wound. They see how their avoidance was born from early experiences of pain, rejection, or neglect, and for the first time, they approach their own story with compassion instead of judgment. They realize that the parts of themselves they've been hiding, the ones that feel needy, fearful, or fragile, are not weaknesses but pieces of their humanity. This self-compassion becomes the foundation of healing. When they stop running from their inner world, they finally start to integrate it. The emotional numbness that once defined them begins to soften. They learn that feeling deeply does not mean losing control, it means reclaiming their wholeness. In time, this awakening transforms how they love. They start to recognize that real intimacy requires risk. The risk of being misunderstood, rejected, or hurt, but also the possibility of being truly seen. They no longer seek partners who make avoidance easy. Instead, they are drawn to those who invite them to stay present, even when it feels uncomfortable. Love becomes less about control and more about connection, less about protection and more about truth. The avoidant, once defined by fear, begins to embody courage, the courage to be open, to be imperfect, to be vulnerable. This is the moment when the cycle of avoidance begins to break, when they stop running from love and start meeting it face to face, not as something to fear, but as the mirror that reveals who they really are. The avoidance journey is not about escaping love, but rediscovering what love truly means beyond fear. Their story is a quiet rebellion against the ghosts of the past, a slow shedding of armor they once believed was essential for survival. They come to learn that safety was never found in distance, but in presence, not in control, but in surrender. The person they ultimately end up with is not determined by chance or fate, but by their willingness to confront their own reflection. Only when they stop searching for someone to make them feel safe and begin to feel safe within themselves do they finally attract the love that mirrors their growth. The truth is, the avoidant doesn't end up with someone who saves them. They end up with someone who meets them where they finally arrive, at the place where fear dissolves, vulnerability breathes, and love is no longer something to survive, but something to live.